Jane Velez-MItchell with Jane Unchained and our continuing coverage of the horror in North Carolina. We have a very special guest, Ethically Elizabeth, who has been on the ground in North Carolina, bringing us some of the photos that we're going to show you right now. Look at this. Look at this horror. These are pigs who have drowned, trapped in prisons called factory farms in North Carolina. Take a look at that innocent little being. What did that being do to deserve that? And of course, if you did it to a dog like the little dog, little Rico, who I'm holding here, you'd be charged with animal cruelty. But 3.4 million at least, and the estimates are going to skyrocket, have died. 3.4 million animals. And of course, our hearts go out to all the humans who have lost their lives, 42 and counting, as well as all those who've been injured. It's not mutually exclusive. So will you tell us, Ethically Elizabeth, what did you see on the ground?
So I arrived in North Carolina right before the storm hit last week on Wednesday evening. Drove from Charlotte to Wilmington and essentially just waited out the storm until the devastation hit. Following that, our team traveled throughout the southeastern portion of North Carolina, in the major heart of hog country, as well as major producers of chickens and turkeys. And what we saw on the ground was absolutely disturbing and horrifying. We were deployed in teams with small boats, so we were able to travel around to different confined animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, which house thousands of animals in these tightly packed windowless sheds. And so what we witnessed from the beginning when we were at the highest peak of floodwaters was water just absolutely to the top of these sheds. Only the roofs were exposed. So these facilities were tightly locked before the storm hit to avoid a public relations nightmare for these companies and these industries. So in the beginning, when the storm had hit, we were not able to see many bodies that were able to escape because the floodwaters were too high and they were pushed to the top of these facilities. And as the water started to recede, we were able to see the animals flowing from some of these openings that were pushed open by the floodwater and the pressure changes. And so we saw thousands of chicken bodies that had escaped from just one facility, one shed of one facility. Thousands of individuals were inside dead. We witnessed the piglets that you can see there. Those were found on site of an operation in dumpsters. And we're not sure if some of them were killed from the floodwaters or if this was just standard practice of thumping the piglets, which also happens when they are too small or sickly from birth. But we absolutely just saw devastating impacts to both human and non-human lives. And it's really indescribable unless you were on the ground. And I've tried to convey that with some of the photos and video content that I've been putting out there, but truly seeing it firsthand is indescribable. The stench from these facilities, the feces and the manure that had overflowed from the open air pits, just something that just breaks your heart.
If people are disgusted by this, first thing, none of this carnage to these animals would be happening if people didn't eat animals and their byproducts. So if this upsets you, I am urging you to consider going vegan. Get rid of the animals on your plate. Otherwise, you have put those animals in that situation. The only reason why these animals are in dumpsters is because they are commodities, they are products, they are considered property. And indeed, we did an interview with a woman who was part of a team who tried to rescue some pigs that were found in distress. And the police came and said, no, they're property. They belong to the quote unquote farmer, and they had to return them. And they were heartbroken. They were sobbing. So they have property. They might as well be in a storage facility. They might as well be just a box or a book or any kind of object. That's how much we have denigrated animals in this society, is that they are not considered beings. They are things. And the news media, we've done stories now in our continuing coverage every day. We here at Jane Unchained are going to keep this story on the forefront, how nobody in the news, in the mainstream media, has exhibited an iota of compassion or empathy for these animals. They only speak about it in terms of, the manure lagoons, which of course, yes, it is a horror and it is going to spill into the surrounding community. And the surrounding community is primarily minority and a low income. And it is an environmental catastrophe. And it is animal agriculture that is creating the warmer waters by being the leading contributor to climate change that is making these catastrophes more frequent and more severe. But they don't connect the dots and they don't show any compassion. So it's up to us. It's up to us human beings, to the people, to stand up and say, we have had enough with this very sick, morally bankrupt system where this poor little being that died is considered, just a write-off. We'll get insurance money. We can restock our warehouses with more of these animals. It's a morally bankrupt system. It's an environmental catastrophe. It's a pollution catastrophe. And it's something that has to end. So what were your experiences on the ground, Elizabeth, as you talk to people who live there? I mean, I'm not going to sit here and just castigate the farmers. Again, it's a consumer issue. But I do feel, and I'm going to officially call right now, these warehouses called factory farms should not be restocked with new animals. We must.
No, they should not. It has to end. Despite the environmental side of things, I think that it's hard for anybody to look at these images and not be moved by them. Nobody can argue that this is acceptable. To do this to animals is acceptable. And they learned their lesson from previous storm events, Hurricane Matthew in 2016 and in 1999, Hurricane Floyd. When those images were leaked to the press, those aerial images that probably most people are familiar with by now, of the pigs standing on top of those sheds on the roof and some of the other bodies that were floating in the water, those industries learned their lesson and they had carefully constructed flood prepared plans for people and these farmers to lock these animals inside to avoid these animals from entering the environment so that people could not see them. But this problem goes beyond the farmers. Like you said, this is a consumer driven issue. If the consumers stop funding these industries and they eat plant-based diets and they purchase plant-based cruelty-free products, we don't have this issue. And this was outside of the just industrial agriculture. We saw signs of abuse and neglect towards domesticated companion animals as well, no different than the dog that you were holding previously. People left their dogs and cats outside, locked inside of homes that were flooding, and they fled. And we also saw dogs that were chained by the neck to trees and other infrastructure. And this was in floodwaters. And these people just left their animals like this. So this is we need a shift of consciousness. It's not even just educating people about factory farming. It's also shifting the consciousness so that people don't view animals as property. We had a rescuer just 2 days ago, 5 days into the storm, 5 days into the floodwaters reaching in some areas 10 to 12 feet, a dog that was left in a chain link pen outside. The water had exceeded the top of this pen, and the dog had been treading water for 5 days.
Oh my God!
Trying to stand his ground on top of a doghouse. So this is not just an issue of factory farm animals. It is on a larger scale. However, this is just a general perspective towards most people and animals. And that's something that we need to work on shifting. We also had a case where there was a deer that we found. A team of ours found a deer on top of a turkey shed. And they were able to get a rescuer to lift this deer off of the shed. The deer had severe lacerations and wounds on their body, and they required immediate veterinary assistance. We had the deer loaded into the back of our vehicle. I was sitting in the trunk with this injured deer, and a wildlife officer came and he refused to let us take this deer to veterinary care. I volunteer with a wildlife rehabilitation center in Miami. I'm familiar with animals, with wild animals, and I know that animal required instant and immediate veterinary care. And just because of the general perspective towards animals, we were unable to give an animal that was probably going to die care, and we had to release her. And so this was an issue of just people just not opening their hearts and minds regardless of the natural disaster and the urgency of the situation.
What ran through your heart when you were forced by authorities to release that deer, just as other rescuers were forced by authorities, and it's all on tape in this other incident, to release pigs that were no longer consumable because they had been in contaminated waters, and the people were begging the authorities and the farmer, just give them to us because we'll take them to a sanctuary. You can't slaughter them for food. What are you going to do with them? And they wanted them back, and they were forced to load them onto the trucks. For what? They can't kill, they legally cannot kill these pigs anymore for food because they're in contaminated waters. What ran through your heart at that moment?
It was absolutely heartbreaking. I physically carried this animal, this injured animal, to a vehicle. She was shaking. She was borderline hypothermic. She had severe injuries. So we had her in a safe place, and we were ready for transport, and we were calling different veterinarians and wildlife rehabilitators. And as the law enforcement officer came to the vehicle, he demanded that we take her out. We refused to take her out, much like the situation that you saw unfold with the pigs. I watched that live stream as well. It was absolutely heartbreaking, especially after volunteers were on the ground for hours protecting these pigs and rescuing them from flooded waters. Similar, I mean, I was trying to remain calm so that I could gain some sort of respect from this officer and hope that he would shed some compassion on this animal. But he used his basis for his knowledge about deer well-being was that he's been a hunter of deer for 25 years. And so that's the general mentality there. So that's very difficult to fight with, especially when somebody is threatening you with multiple fines. He did have a gun. So it's a high energy, very confrontational type of situation. And we did try, and we did document it all. Our film team on the ground, Condition 1, they were making a documentary, and that footage will be included in that documentary when it does air. So we also have that on tape. And so when we were forced to carry this animal outside of the vehicle and ultimately let her go, it was heartbreaking, and it just feels like there's nothing you can do. You feel helpless and hopeless, and you just hope the best for this animal. But seeing the kind of condition she was in, I'm not confident that she survived.
It's really morally reprehensible. And people who say, well, that's just the way it is. I've said it before, I'll say it again. There is nothing to be proud of if you are simply cool with a sick society. If you're well adjusted to a morally bankrupt society, it's nothing to be proud of. We have officially entered a terrain that is sociopathic, where the news media cannot even acknowledge the suffering of these animals. I mean, look at this animal. That is an individual. He was an individual who had a mother, who wanted to live, who, pigs dream. Anybody who has dogs know this little guy is always barking in his dreams. Pigs dream. They have the emotional and intellectual development of toddler human children. And the media, it's verboten, absolutely verboten to show any kind of compassion. We can only talk about them in terms of, what is the economic damage and how do we restock these animals and the insurance. And yes, we can talk about their manure. How would you like it if your life was boiled down to the manure you left behind?
Right.
Okay. So this is sick. It's morally reprehensible. And it's time that we call BS on all the institutions, the media, the local authorities, the USDA, the big food, big pharma complex that says this is just fine. You can even call yourself an animal lover and eat bacon and contribute to this horror, okay? Right. Take that and multiply it thousands and thousands of times. That's what's happening in North Carolina right now. And take other images and multiply it. Take this image, okay, and multiply it millions of times. Yep. At least 3 million chickens drowned in warehouses in these. Imagine they left the animals there. If there is no evacuation plan, and this has happened before, it happened in Matthew, it happened in Hurricane Florence, it happened in Hurricane Floyd. This is not the first time this has happened. They know what is going to happen, and with climate change, it's going to happen more often. I am officially calling right now for an investigation, for a freeze on restocking these animals to these animal prisons called factory farms that are essentially giant warehouses. Okay, that's all the photos you're looking at right here were taken by Ethically Elizabeth on the ground in the last couple of days. Because some people say, oh, you know, where did these come from? No, you took these photos. They are here. They are evidence of what is going on. And it's just morally reprehensible. And it's time for everybody to say, we want an investigation. We want to freeze. We want to freeze on this industry just for environmental reasons and pollution reasons. I mean, Elizabeth, I'm sure you were concerned for your own health. I saw you in a canoe or some small boat going around in these sewage infested waters. The manure from these animals, they have these giant, they call them manure lagoons. They're literally lakes of manure that were spilling over into the surrounding community. I know that recently there have been lawsuits against these factory farms from people that live in the vicinity, say they're getting sick. So what did you experience in terms of how it's impacting people in that area?
I spoke to a few individuals that had lived in these local communities for years, and they did tell me that all of these facilities continue to rebuild within flood-prone areas. They build bigger and more sheds for these animals, knowing that they are at risk of flooding and drowning. And they also said that it was disgusting. They warned not to go into the water, that it was infected with bacteria. And this is antibiotic resistant bacteria. And it's polluting the environment, as you said, but it also poses many risks to humans as well as other non-human animals. So we were very careful with being protective. We wore waders and boots, but you can never be too careful with this stuff because you can carry it with you and potentially infect other people. So that's just one of the many risks of this bacteria and the contamination that is polluting our waterways, our groundwater, and ultimately it's just flowing out into the open environment. I mean, we are talking storm surges of over 20 feet in a lot of areas. So all of these manure lagoons, there's over 3,000 manure lagoons in the state of North Carolina. Can you imagine? These are Olympic swimming pool size facilities, lagoons, and these are just overflowing. I mean, we were boating through these lagoons. The stench is, you gag as you go through it. Every facility that we approached, we boated past or to about 15 to 20 CAFOs, large scale animal agricultural facilities. And many of them housed dead animals inside. We were unable to get to them. They were already dead at that point. And the smell was absolutely putrid. It burns your nose, it burns your throat and your eyes. It's full of ammonia, so many different contaminants. There's flies surrounding the area. So you really do have to be very careful when you're entering these areas. And these are things that the local residents are aware of because they've experienced it before. And like you said, many are low income minority populations. And we were warned, and some of the locals did tell us that some of the agricultural facilities that we were not able to get to due to travel constraints or different floodwater issues, that there were dead animals inside. And they confirmed that because these people are aware. It's a small community. They've lived there their whole lives. They know how many animals are in these sheds. They know when the slaughter trucks come to pick them up. And we did see, as I drove from Charlotte, North Carolina on early Thursday morning to Wilmington, North Carolina, on early Thursday morning, I saw many trucks, these death wagons, slaughter trucks, trucking out these animals, chickens and pigs specifically, to slaughter before the hurricane hit. So even when we talk about, say, 3.4 million chickens and turkeys and 5,500 pigs that drown, and I believe that's a conservative number based on the pure number of flooded sheds that I personally witnessed. All of these animals, the 800 million farmed animals currently in the state of North Carolina, they are all facing a horrific, unnecessary death. So even if these animals did not drown in the floodwaters, they are facing a sure and imminent death. And so they are all at risk, and they're only at risk because people, the consumers, are paying for their bodies. And that's the only reason that these are issues that we are dealing with today.
And I'm urging everyone, share this video so that your friends and family who are still eating animals can see the wreckage that they are causing and maybe have a moment of clarity. And I am officially today calling for an investigation into these factory farms, these warehouses filled with thousands of dead pigs, into why we are allowing this to happen over and over again. It happened in 1999 with a hurricane. It happened in 2016 with a hurricane or a severe storm. Now it's happening again. And, you know, if you set up shop in a flood zone or in a landslide zone and your house keeps getting destroyed, eventually the insurance companies can say, you know, we're not insuring you. Why is it that this is allowed to go on, repeat over and over again? I don't know all the nuances of insurance, but I do know that there is government insurance in many cases for these farmers. So we, the taxpayers, taxpayers are paying for all of this carnage, all of this horror, all of this environmental wreckage, all of this cruelty, and they're going to set up shop and do it all again. And once again, I am not pointing my finger at the individuals who run these farms. It is much bigger than that. And I shouldn't even call them farms, warehouses. It is so much more than that. It is the US government. It is our corrupt political system. It is big ag and big pharma. And as somebody very smart said, they're farming humans too. Because the reason why they want to keep this system going is that they make tons of money when we eat processed meat, which is how most people eat pig. They eat pig in the form of processed meat. Processed meat is officially cancer-causing, according to the World Health Organization. That's bacon, that's ham, that's hot dogs, that's sausage. Processed meat is cancer-causing. So they feed you this food. It's destroying the environment. It's contributing to climate change. It's contributing to pollution, habitat destruction, wildlife extinction, and human health problems. And then they make a ton of money feeding you the cholesterol-lowering drugs and treating you for the cancers and treating you for all the illnesses that come as a result of our unhealthy meat and dairy-laden diet. And it has to end. And right now, everybody needs to stand up and say, do not restock these very flawed warehouses with more animals, because these hurricanes and these storms are happening more frequently. And, you know, the first time you could say, okay, it's a terrible tragedy. Who knew? The second time you could say, oh, gosh, we didn't know it was going to happen again. But the third time, no. You know, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So would you join me, Liz Jones, Ethically Elizabeth, in calling for an immediate investigation by the federal government into what's going on with these factory farms?
Absolutely. And I have lots of evidence and documentation of these events, and these are crimes, and we should call them that, because like you said, this keeps happening. We keep backing it. We are getting subsidized products, cheap cholesterol-laden, saturated fat-laden products, and it's coming at the expense of our health, of the environment, and of course, these animal victims that are experiencing this horrific cruelty firsthand. So absolutely, anything that you need from me, I am 100% on board. I am willing to provide any photo documentation, video footage of these tragedies occurring, as I just witnessed them over the last week in North Carolina.
Well, we may very well call on you to do that, because we're gathering a coalition to stand up and demand action. We, the people, have to rise up. We have obviously a very tribal, divided political system that is extraordinarily dysfunctional right now. But the truth is, while we point the finger at climate change deniers, if we're consuming animals, which I certainly don't, or animal byproducts, we're also climate change deniers, because in that consumption of that animal product, you are contributing to climate change. It is arguably the leading cause of climate change. The United Nations Livestock's Long Shadow Report many years ago said that animal agriculture contributes more to global warming and climate change than all transportation combined. World Bank economists said that was a wild underestimate. It's actually more than 50% of all climate change. And even if you're a climate change denier, we are 7.6 billion human beings. We raise and kill between 60 and 70 billion so-called farm animals, chickens, pigs, turkeys, lambs, goats, cows, every year. Those animals eat a lot more than they produce as meat. They are consuming most of the food products that we're producing. So what we're doing is we're destroying forests to grow crops to feed animals, and it takes 10 to 25 pounds of grain to create 1 pound of steak. So most of what we're destroying for cropland is going into animals, which is the most inefficient food source. And that means it's contributing to world hunger as well. Not to mention that none of these animals are making love in these factory farms. They are sexually violated. And there's even a term in the industry, you can look it up and Google it, rape rack. The males are masturbated, the females are sexually violated with that semen. So if you're a feminist, you should also be horrified. And if you're a humanitarian or a progressive who doesn't want to see the exploitation of poor people, when you look at these animals, don't you get the sense that if Americans who are eating all this meat had to kill the animals themselves, 95% of the people would be unable to do it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think most people, especially those who have companion animals at home, cats and dogs typically, are capable of looking these animals in the eye and stabbing them in the throat. And that's essentially exactly what they do. And it's a barbaric system. It's outdated, it's archaic, and it does not belong in a civilized society.
And, we need to evolve. Like, this needs to go into mainstream media. Yes, it does need to go into mainstream media, but it's not. Yes, they are talking about all the animals that died. Who died? Excuse me, I correct myself. Who died? These are individuals. They're not things. And yes, they are talking about the environmental wreckage in the form of the manure lagoon spilling over, but they are not doing two things. A, nobody that I have seen on mainstream media, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I would love to see somebody show an ounce of compassion who was on a mainstream television news show to these animals and say, oh my God, that is a horror. Any of us who have dogs and cats at home, can you imagine these animals being trapped in these cages as the floodwater rises while they're in these darkened warehouses that have been abandoned by human beings, unable, in some cases, maybe to turn around as the water rises higher and higher and higher and finally drowns them? No, there is no compassion that I've been able to observe watching the news media, and I'm calling them on that. That is, the idea, my gosh, Gary Yourofsky said it. We have, and I'm going to put his quote up. We have denigrated animals to the point that they are not even beings. They are considered things, and as things, they don't even deserve. Let me show you the quote, because it's a great quote, and I'd like you to be able to see it to yourself. I'm going to try to get this quote up right now because it says it all right there. I'm going to show you solo. Okay, the problem is that humans have victimized animals to such a degree that they are not even considered victims. They are not even considered at all. They are nothing. They don't count. They don't matter. They are commodities. Okay? Like TV sets and cell phones, we have actually turned animals into inanimate objects, sandwiches and shoes. So chew on that for a little bit. And honestly, if after seeing some of these images, you can still go out and eat a meat burger or a pork rinds or whatever, I would just urge you to get some help, because, that's just the inability to really come to terms. The denial of what is happening to these animals is so intense in our culture because people are so brainwashed. We are all hit, I was even in Luxembourg, I was on the way to the animal rights conference, and I walked from my little hotel to the animal rights conference, and I decided to count in this small town how many images of meat consumption I was hit with on the way. and it was something like 25, and it was a tiny little village. Signs, billboards, people actually selling animals. We are constantly conditioned, and these advertisers subliminally manipulate us to associate, for men, masculinity with meat, for women, femininity with dairy. That's why it's easier for men to give up dairy and easier for women to give up meat, with family values, with upward mobility, with sex appeal, with all sorts of things that have zero to do with eating dead animals.
Right, and these are government-funded programs. This is subsidized. It's artificially cheap, and so the government is pushing these products towards its consumers. It's not just an issue of the farmer, because it's not really a farmer at this point, okay? Like you said before, it's warehouses. There's no farming happening at these places. These animals, even outside of storm events, can be left for days, and they have these mechanized food systems where it's supposed to feed them automatically and provide water. And many times these things they are not operable, they dysfunction. So these animals sometimes are left for days without food and water, and this is just standard industry practice. The abuse is across the board. It's not one isolated incident. It's not one isolated natural disaster or one industry. It's across the board. It's animal abuse. It's human abuse. It's environmental abuse. And these are crimes that we need to continue to call them out for, because absolutely there's no presence in the mainstream media of anyone showing the actual victims and giving them any shred of justice, which is what they require.
And please share this video. We've got 280 shares so far, and that's great, because we need to wake people up. You know, it reminds me of when in the days of the Soviet Union, people were trying to get the word out about freedom, and they would be persecuted and thrown in the gulag if they were caught, and they handed out little pieces of paper. You know,
right.
This is what the internet is. This is what social media is, because you will not see this on mainstream media. Okay, they will not talk. Why? Look at the advertisers, fast food and pharmaceuticals, the two industries that would collapse if people woke up and realized, oh my God, they're destroying the planet, they're torturing animals, they're polluting our environment, they're making me sick. Why am I contributing to this? Especially when there are meat alternatives. If you want the taste of meat, I've got a stack of Beyond Burgers that actually taste so much like meat, I freak out, okay? Because you can't tell the difference. The reason being that there is something in meat called heme, H-E-M-E, which is what gives it its meaty taste, its meaty texture, and its aroma. And that also exists in plants. And now the meat alternative people have identified the heme in plants, and they're putting them into meat alternative products, so they look, they taste, and they even smell like meat. So
right.
if and cheeses, I mean, there's cashew cheese, there's almond cheese, there's soy cheese, there's all these different cheeses. So tell me, you know, what next? Because you, I'm sure, are a little traumatized by what you've seen, and I want to say you're my hero for going there, because you know what? I can sit here all day long and talk to people who are there. This woman got off her chair, got, you know, into a plane or a car, went to North Carolina, got into boats, and went to the heart of darkness. And I want to thank you for doing that. But what next? What next for you and this crusade?
Well, thank you. It was definitely very traumatic to be there and experience it firsthand. It was heartbreaking. It was impossible not to break down. And of course, I carry that tragedy with me. And I am fueled by that, though. As traumatic as it was, I'm fueled by that now to continue the mission to bring down these industries and to expose them for the criminals that they are. So anybody that is willing to fight on behalf of animals, and we need everybody to fight on behalf of animals, vegans and non-vegans to become vegans. We need everybody fighting and being active. So I am going to continue to push forward, share these images, write content, share it with the world, and hope that others will share it as well, so that we can reach the masses, because the public, the general public and the masses need to see these things. They're constantly bombarded with propaganda on billboards, on television sets, and it's nonstop. So they're just conditioned to believe that this is okay and it's normal and natural and necessary, when you've just described some of these amazing products that exist. There's no reason for it anymore. It does not It should not exist in a civilized society. And just like we used to have slaves and women didn't have the right to vote and same-sex couples couldn't get married, we need to add eating animals used to be legal to that list. We need to do away with this and move towards the alternatives and do away with these cruel products that are totally unnecessary. Most people, even in rural parts of the country and throughout the world, have access to plant-based alternatives. And a lot of people like to use the excuse that, well, being a vegan costs a lot of money. And sure, you can spend a lot of money being a vegan, but you can also be a meat eater and go to a steakhouse every night. Some of the cheapest foods on the planet are plant-based foods, your rice, your beans, your staple crops. And that's why many of the most poor people in the world do consume a primarily plant-based diet. So there's really no excuse at this point. We have these products at our fingertips. The knowledge is on the internet. We have social media. If you have access to an iPhone or a computer and you're watching this right now, there's no excuse for you not to know better. And there's no excuse for you not to go forward with a message of compassion and action for the animals.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. I really feel this has to be a turning point. This carnage, this horror, it needs to be called out for what it is. And anyone in a position of authority, as part of any aspect of our society, the media, government, business, who does not stand up and say, enough, okay? This reminds me after some of these mass shootings that we've had where courageous young people stood up and said, we call BS enough.
Right.
It's the same kind of feeling. We call BS enough. Enough of this sociopathic, institutionalized sadism. No more. And I promise you right now, I am going to work every single day as a mission, my life's mission. It's always been, but seeing this carnage and the reaction, the lack of reaction by people in power and authority who feel that they would be denigrated to even say one word about the suffering of the animals, that they're so serious and they're so intellectual or they're so whatever that they can't even spare a second, an ounce, an iota of compassion for these innocent beings who had the misfortune of being born in the form of farm animals, so-called farm animals, that they can't spare it. Shame on them. You know, I mean, literally, wake up, people, before our planet is destroyed, because we are heading toward an environmental apocalypse that is going to make Hurricane Florence and all the other hurricanes look like a tea party. All right. Thank you so much. I think we've said it, and I hope that you don't forget it. More will be revealed.